And then I look to my left, and this deer is walking down this trail like he freaking owns the place. And I'm like, holy cow, that's him. This is the second time I've ever seen him in person. And he's even bigger than the pictures do him justice, you know, like he's massive.
Oh, you got her, dude. She's down. Let's go.
Dude, I just shot a deer of a lifetime.
Freaking smoked him.
One with nature, and if you're a believer, one with God.
Definitely gets your heart pumping. Boy, you are in trouble.
Fall Obsession Podcast.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to another Fall Obsession Podcast episode driven by Ridge Rock Hunt Company. Derek, Lacey, fine folks over there. We will give them a proper shout out at the end in our sponsor segment. I am Sam with Fall Obsession, your podcast host. Thanks for tuning in, and back on here again with our media production manager, my good buddy Nick Powell. What's up, buddy?
Hey, how's it going, Sam?
Good, man. Happy to be back on here. Still recording virtually. I know we always talk about how much we like recording in person, but it seems to be the way that we're going right now. So
yeah, it's just easier.
Yeah.
You know, it's easier for everybody. We all have busy lives, and so this is one way to keep the content coming to our listeners. So
absolutely, yeah,
we got to do what we got to do. You know,
absolutely, and we're doing. Obviously, we're able, with the virtual aspect of our podcast, we're able to bring a lot more guests that we wouldn't get to interact with otherwise. And now we're doing even more of this is what we would call an in-house podcast, you know, just with our own guys and everything. We're doing more of those virtually as well. One thing we are going to try to do, and unfortunately it's not coupled with this one, but you guys saw it with last week's episode with special guest Mark Zorich. We actually had a podcast video to go with our virtual podcast, and that's something that in the future we're going to be pushing for more eventually, the goal being pretty much almost every podcast episode having a video to go with it. So just be looking for that. I know some people like to watch podcast episodes. Some people, like myself, just prefer to listen, but there is a pretty big following out there that like to watch them. So we're going to try to, another part of our media production thing we're implementing for 2022, that's one thing we're shooting for, is trying to give you guys more of that kind of content. So that's coming soon. Well, today, what we're going to dive into, we're kind of going back to our 2021 season recaps. I know we've had a few guests on talking about that kind of stuff, and obviously a big center of our content this last year was our Texas Dirt Series and this property that myself, Nick, and both of our dads have been working on and basically acquired, hopefully for years to come, to hunt together several hundred acres. And kind of our first year on that and how all that transpired. My dad and I did a podcast kind of to conclude the year, but we still haven't heard about Nick and kind of how your season went and everything like that. And I know you, aside from the Texas Dirt property, you have another pursuit of a pretty big whitetail on your other hunting property that will probably take up a big portion of this conversation. But yeah. We want to jump on here and again share with you guys our stories and some of the good, the bad, and the ugly that we've been dealing with for the 2021 season. This we're blue collar outdoorsmen like the rest of everybody, so by no means is easy for us like most people out there. So Nick, I'm handing it to you, man. Let's dive in and unpack your 2021 whitetail season.
all right, sounds good. So I'll preface this by saying I have 4 different stories that pretty much sums up how my season went, and these stories are all in chronological order, and I will be specific on where they're at, where they happen, and everything else. So to start off the season, it was early season, bow only season. I'll preface this by saying that I have 2 different properties that I hunt. I have one in Collin County that you guys have heard about on the podcast already, but then I also hunt our new lease, our new property in the Texas Dirt Series that we hunt with Sam and our dads. And so this first story takes place at the lease, and it is early season, bow only season out there. So it's you can hunt with crossbows and vertical bows, which is different in Collin County, 2 different counties. So, and I'm just going down there for one day, and it's a, I guess it's a weekend, but it's one night. So I'm hunting one night, staying the night, hunting the next morning, and then we're leaving. Me and my wife are out there together. And this is also in the Texas Dirt series. You can watch the whole video there. But to sum up how my season started, me and my wife sit and we don't see anything the first morning or the first evening. So the next morning we sit in one of our ground blinds that we have out there. I think it was your setup, Sam. And so we have a few does come into the feeder, 2 or 3, and it's really early. Like I'm talking first weekend that we are allowed to hunt. And so it's not opening weekend, but it's like the weekend after that. And so basically my goal in this trip was, if I see a big buck, one of our shooters that we had on camera out at the lease, I was going to shoot him. If there was a legal spike, I was going to shoot him. And so with my eyes pretty much on a big buck, we sat that next morning and we had a few does come in. Wasn't really looking for a doe. There's plenty of time in the rest of the season to shoot a doe. But then we have a small buck, and then this spike comes in. So there's a small little, I think it was a little 6-pointer, a little 8-pointer, something like that. And then this spike came in. He had 4 points on one side, and then the other side was just a perfect straight spike. And so I text you, Sam, and I was like, hey, man, this is a legal spike. Should I shoot him? Because this is the first deer that's going to be shot on this place.
Yeah.
And I was real nervous, and I was like, man, this is a big deal. Like, should I shoot him? And you gave me the go ahead, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to text my dad and ask him to see what he thinks. And Dad said, yeah, he needs to be shot. And so I had the go ahead from both you guys, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to freaking do it. I'm going to shoot this dude. And so my wife is recording, and when I draw back, he looks at me. And he's kind of quartering to me just slightly. And as soon as I draw back, he sees me move. And so he kind of perks his head up a little bit more. And then as soon as I pull that trigger, he sees that arrow coming to him, and he ducks probably a foot. It had to have been a foot.
100%.
And so my arrow hit him right in the top of the shoulder, which is like no man's land. That's where you don't want to hit him, for those of you who are wondering. The arrow penetrates probably 2 or 3 inches, and then he takes off into the brush. And so I'm like, well, we look at the footage and the arrow, we see him run off, the arrow's sticking out of him and everything. And I'm like, well, who knows? We'll see. Maybe it clips something. You never know. And so we wait a little while, about 30 minutes to an hour. And I know everybody's probably going to yell at me for this, but we were eager. And so we probably got out there a little sooner than we were supposed to, but we were super eager to go look and see if we could find anything. I knew it wasn't a good hit. And so I know you're supposed to wait a long time, but we were supposed to leave in 3 hours. I think we were supposed to head home, so we couldn't wait all that long. So we go out there and look for blood, and eventually we find one little tiny drop. We track this deer for 250 yards, and it's just one little drop after the other, probably every 10 to 15 yards. And we lose blood like every so often, and then we pick it up again. And so it's just a really hard track. But we eventually have to make the tough decision to pull out, and we have to leave. So we never saw that deer again. We never got another picture of him. And I'm not sure if we ever got a picture of him before this hunt. I can't remember exactly.
No. So the Spy Point sent me, obviously after your hunt, it sent me the photos and everything from that morning, and it was a bachelor group of bucks that came in.
Yeah.
And they had to be just passing through, man, because we had never seen any of those bucks before, and we never saw. I think we counted 5. I want to say that number sticks in my head, that there was 5 of them in that group.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And we never saw a single one of those bachelor bucks again. The rest of the season, not a single one of them. It was strange.
Yeah, that's right. And so, we never got another picture of this spike. And so I'm confident that he is still alive and kicking today because the hit was not very good. Like, whenever you watch, if y'all go watch the video on our YouTube channel,
I think it's episode 4.
that sounds right. Yeah. Cause you had been out there a few times and made a few episodes before that. So if y'all go watch the video, I zoom in on this spike and slow it down to where you can really see where the arrow hit and everything. And if you keep an eye on where the arrow hit the deer and how he was standing before he ducked, that shot would have been money. It would have been a 10 ring, and he wouldn't have gone very far. But you know, that's part of bow hunting, and it happens. And that's just how it goes sometimes. Yeah. So that was the start of my season.
Man, you said it. That's part of bow hunting, and nobody wants that to happen to them. It's happened to everybody. If you've been bow hunting more than just a season or so, it's happened to you, surely. And if it hadn't, there's a good chance it might at some point if you continue to bow hunt.
Exactly.
And what it comes down to is just with these deer, when you're as close as we are, and when you are at their level as far as ground level, and they are on alert, they have you pegged, you almost have to account for that drop because they're on alert. They're waiting for something to happen. They're waiting to give them a reason to duck down and take off.
Right.
And yeah, you almost have to account for that drop, and that it's unfortunately, unless it's happened to you before, it's not at the forefront of a lot of bow hunters' minds.
Yeah, and that was an important lesson that I learned. I'll say it like this: I haven't shot too many deer with my bow, and so this was going to be maybe the third deer I've ever shot with a bow, and so I'm still learning. I'm still new at this whole thing, and so that was an important lesson that I learned that will come into play later in my season. Now I'll move to the next story. This one takes place in Collin County, and I've had my eye on this deer for at least 2 years. Last year, he had just a perfect mainframe. This year, he's got a couple of kickers and is even more massive than he was last year. I've only seen him once in person, but we have numerous pictures on him. There's no doubt in my mind that he's a mature buck. I mean, he's a monster, and so he was my number one target deer this year out of any place that I hunt. And so it was one morning. I can't remember the exact day. I want to say it was the end of November 27th, I think, the day after, I think it was the Sunday after Thanksgiving, the Sunday morning after Thanksgiving. And it's really cold. It's the perfect morning. And the stand I'm sitting in overlooks a creek. And the creek is the property line. But we do have permission to shoot across the creek if we want to, or if we have the opportunity to. So it looks over a creek. It's about 40 yards offset off of the creek. And it's a pretty decent incline, right? The bank of the creek is probably it's a really steep grade up, probably a 10-foot grade difference, and then it raises up probably another 5 or 10 foot to my stand. So it's a constant uphill.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a trail directly in front of me, and I'm sitting in a tripod with no cover, basically. It has a little camouflage drape around it, and this deer comes down this trail to my left across a draw that's on our side of the creek. Comes down this trail, and I'm like, holy cow, that's him. And so this trail is probably about 35 yards. And so I'm like, just before this, there was a little button buck that had made his way to the feeder, which is to my right. So if I'm looking at the creek, feeder's to my right, trail's to my left. Well, this button buck, and I think there might have been a couple of does there or something, were eating. So I had my focus on them for the longest time, and they were just eating, playing around. And eventually they walk off. And then I look to my left, and this deer is walking down this trail like he freaking owns the place. And I'm like, holy cow, that's him. This is the second time I've ever seen him in person. And he's even bigger than the pictures do him justice, like he's massive. And so he walks down this trail, and this trail leads down into the creek. Okay, so like he walks down this trail into the creek, and there's another trail coming up our side of the bank that would basically, once he walked up it, he's looking directly at me. And so he walks right up this trail, right where I need him to, basically. Like, he couldn't have done it any more textbook than what I needed him to do.
Yeah.
And so he walks directly up this trail, and as soon as he hits the peak of that bank, he has me pegged. And I have a leafy suit, the First Light leafy suit, and so he can't really tell what I am. But when I saw him come down the trail, I immediately stood up because I knew I was going to shoot this deer. I keep an arrow knocked in, but I put my release on my D-loop to get ready because I knew as soon as he gave me a shot, I was going to take it. Comes down the trail, comes up the bank, he's got me pegged. He knows something's not right in that tripod. So he's looking at me, and he'll look down, and he'll look at me, and he'll look down, and then he kind of turns broadside, but he's slightly quartering two. So this sounds pretty familiar, right? Like the spike was quartering two as well. Just a hair, but he's mostly broadside. And I'm like, holy cow, this is exactly what I needed him to do. And so he puts his head down again, and I draw back. And as soon as I draw back, the same thing happens. He jerks his head up and looks straight at me. And so the same thing happened with the spike. And I'm thinking of the spike as this is going on. Like, I'm thinking, okay, he has me pegged. I need to aim low because if he sees me shoot, he's gonna drop. He's gonna duck.
Yeah. So
I aim low. I have a thought of I need to hurry before he bolts because he's got me pegged. And so I squeeze. I pull a shot off, and it hits him, but it hits him really low. Like, I can see there's only probably 4 or 5 inches of penetration that I can tell, and I can see the arrow hanging out of him. He dives off into the creek, back down the bank, and then dives up that same trail he came up. But he's not running. He stops on that trail and then walks a little bit where he can see me, and he's trying to figure out what I am still. He's not sure what just happened.
Right.
So he's looking at me, and my arrow had fallen out of him. And so he's looking at me on the other side of this trail, and that trail goes up, and there's an opening up that trail that's probably 40 or 45 yards. And so I'm like, okay. And I know this because I have sat in the stand numerous times, and I've ranged multiple trees around me. So hot tip, if you have a tree stand that you sit in, range trees that are in your shooting lanes because you could potentially need them and you won't have time to range them. So I'm like, okay, if he gets in this opening, I'm going to take another shot at him because this dude is not even acting like I hit him. And so eventually he blows at me, and which I know is not a good sign. He blows at me and then starts walking up this trail and doesn't ever stop. But he never runs off. He never runs or at the most he trotted, I'll say, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but he never ran off. He blew at me 3 different times and would kept turning around and looking, seeing if he could figure out what I was. And so he eventually takes off, and I'm like, holy cow, I just blew it. I blew this whole thing. This is the only time I'm ever going to see this deer again. My whole world is crashing down in my mind as I speak. And because he wasn't even acting like he was hit. And so being eager again, I get out of my stand, go down to see if I can find my arrow because I knew it was right there. There's a 20-yard shot. He dove off into the creek, and so I'm like, my arrow's got to be down there somewhere. So I go and see if there's any blood. There was a little bit of blood when I shot him, and I went and found my arrow, and sure enough, there was probably 4 or 5 inches of blood with some white hair, which is not good because they have white hair on their undercarriage.
Right.
And so I'm like, I know I shot him low because he did not duck at all, of course. And so the shot was low. I knew that, but I was like, okay, I'm just going to go get back in the stand. Maybe he'll come back. So I sit there for about an hour, and I'm like, well, the worst I could do is just go look and see if there's any blood at all. Because if there's a little bit of blood, like the spike, more than likely he's going to be fine, and I'm not going to find him. So I get down about an hour and a half later. I go to where he went back up the other side of the draw, back up the trail, and I'm looking, and there's a lot of blood. I think I had texted you at this point, showing you the arrow, seeing what you thought. I text my dad. I called my wife. Like, I'm trying to figure out as much as I can to see what other people are thinking, because I'm obviously not thinking clear. I'm freaking out. Bug fever got a hold of me after that pretty good. Anyways, so I go down and I'm looking for blood, and I'm actually finding really good blood, like bright red. A couple of it has bubbles in it, but there's really good blood when he went back up the trail. At first there was good blood, and then he started dripping, and then like you could tell where he would stop because there would be like a puddle probably the size of a volleyball on the ground. I have probably 4 or 5 pictures of little puddles of bright red bubbly blood from when I was tracking him. And I got on onX, and I did the line marker, and it'll tell you, or the distance line, and it ended up it was kind of a rough estimate on where I had been, but I had ended up tracking him almost 700 yards until I lost blood.
Wow.
And that's not the craziest part of the story. Here's the crazy part. When I found last blood, I was across the creek. He had crossed the creek at another point on down the creek. He had crossed it and gone up probably a 45-degree incline, probably a 50-foot, 45-degree incline bank, like climbed straight up it. So I got to the top of that. That's where I found last blood. So I'm like, well, I'm just going to, maybe he's laying around somewhere over here. I've got a long trail with really good blood. He's lost a lot. Maybe he'll be laid up somewhere over here. And so there's a pasture directly across the creek, and it's higher on one side than it is on the other side. So I take the high side and walk down the high side of the creek, thinking maybe that's the bedding area. Maybe he went to his bedding area to lay down, thinking I might jump him or something, because I just want to see him to make sure he's okay, whatever. So I walk probably 500 yards down the edge of this, don't see anything at all. And I walk back, and when I'm 200 yards from, probably around 200 yards from where I started, I look up, and he's standing there staring at me.
Oh my gosh.
At the end of the pasture. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And immediately as I stop, I'm trying, because I left my bow at last blood because I didn't want to lose it. So I don't have my bow on me. And so I'm getting my binoculars to look, because he's facing broadside the same way that I shot him. And so I want to see if there's anything, there's a giant mark on him, whatever, if there's a big blood stain on his side or whatever. I can't see anything just looking at him. So I go to get my binoculars, and he immediately bolts and takes off into the trees. And so I'm like, well, doesn't look hurt at all whatsoever. He blows at me again. Doesn't look injured whatsoever. So I'm like, well, that pretty much solidifies that.
Yeah, for sure.
But just to make double sure, I go and I check really thoroughly the area where he was standing and the area where it looked like he took off, and there was 0 blood on the ground. And so, long story short, that didn't go my way either. And then a week later, or even I think it was 2 or 3 days later, we get another picture of him going to that same feeder that I was sitting over. And so he was still alive. Just an update. This was the end of November. It's now the beginning of February, and we have gotten several pictures of him after that. Like the last picture was on the 22nd of January, I think. So
still
he
kicking.
is still alive and well. Looking forward to him dropping. Hopefully we'll find his sheds, because that would be freaking sweet. Anyways.
Yeah. Man.
Yeah. So that's pretty much that. Yeah. So that was kind of the highlight of my season and the lowest point of my season.
Yeah. Highlight, because how many times do you get a shot at a big deer like that low point because of everything that happened after the shot. So
Exactly. So it was a emotional roller coaster that entire week. And because I had gone 2 or 3 days or 3 or 4 days before seeing a picture of him and confirming that he was still alive. And so I was like, man, I'm going to be real bummed if we don't see him again and he's dead somewhere and we can't find him. That would have been worst case scenario, but luckily for me, we got pictures of him one after the other the following months. So yeah, it was an emotional roller coaster there for about a week. I was a mess, you could say. But that leads me to my next story. So I keep hunting, and this year I like to say that this season I hunted more than I have in the last probably 8 to 10 years. Like I've hunted a lot.
yeah.
Put a lot of time in the woods. So this next story, we have a buck that we've seen on camera called Freak Nasty. So Freak Nasty is a buck. I'll describe him a little bit. So early in the season, I was actually getting out of the stand, walking up to the house, and I jumped him in a food plot. And when I first saw him, I was like, man, that buck looks weird, because he stopped in the food plot and looked at me and then immediately bolted. I was like, dang, that buck looks really, really strange. So his left side comes kind of out, like not straight up, but it doesn't really go straight out either. It's like at that perfect angle where it goes up and out. And then the right side is just jacked up. Like, I don't know if he got injured or if he just got some sort of skull deformity or what his deal is, but the right side is jacked up. Like, it doesn't go out. It kind of goes down
Yeah.
and out. Like, it's really hard to describe. When y'all see the picture, y'all will understand. But this is another deer that we've gotten several pictures of, and that I didn't really know how big he was because we've only gotten pictures. So when I saw him early season, he still didn't look that big because I saw him for a split second. But then after I saw him that first time, we got more clearer pictures of him and realized that he was actually a mature deer that was worth a shot if we got it. And so I go down one, sit in the same stand that I saw my big deer. I'm sitting in the same stand, and this is probably the middle of December, I would say, and it is a really slow morning. Like, I usually get in the stand probably an hour before sunlight or before legal shooting light just to make sure I'm there. And pictures we're getting are all nighttime pictures also. So this is after the rut. And I've heard of the second rut, but I've never seen it in person. Well, this morning I was going to see it. And this is, like I said, middle of December, really slow morning. I don't see a single thing until about 8:30 or 9, I want to say. I see a doe. I'm sitting in the same stand, so just imagine the creek, feeder to my right, trail to my left, whatever. I see a doe across the creek running from my right to my left, and running at a pretty healthy pace. She runs and then kind of bolts off in the opposite direction. And then right after that, I see Freak Nasty chasing her, and Chase is right behind her. And so I'm like, whoa, that was him. That's super cool. I hadn't seen anything all morning. It's a really slow morning. It's kind of warm also. And so my expectations weren't high. But after seeing them, I had some hope. And then all of a sudden, I wait about 20 minutes, and the doe comes back. She comes back my way, doesn't quite cross the creek, but gets to the edge of it. And he's following right behind her. And I'm like, holy cow, they're coming back. I'm freaking out again, but I know in my head it's automatic. If I get a shot at this deer, I'm going to take it. And so she stops on the other side of the creek and actually beds down. And so he's looking for her for a little while and then realizes where she is. And then he's stone cold, not moving.
Yeah.
And I don't have a grunt call or anything with me. And I really don't want to use it anyways because I'm kind of confused when this is happening because it's rut activity, but it's middle of December, not middle of November. So I'm like, what is going on?
What's going on? Yeah.
And so I just kind of sit there and wait for them to make their move. And after about, she probably beds down, like just in this random spot for probably 10 minutes. And I have a picture of where they were. Like I circled where she was laying and I circled where he was, and he was right behind a tree, probably at about 45 yards. But he was behind this big tree right in front of me, so I didn't have a shot. And so she stands up eventually, and she makes her way down into the creek, and he kind of goes around the long way, finds a draw, and comes down into the creek following her. And she comes up the same trail that Big Buck did in the last story. Comes up the same trail up our side of the bank and literally runs to my left past the stand, probably 15 yards from me. And so I'm like, holy cow, he's going to follow her right there. And so I'm getting ready, right? Well, he comes up a different trail, passes, goes right by the feeder on my right, and which I'm a right-handed shooter, so I have to, with him on my right, I'm having to turn around, and he's trotting the whole way. And so I'm like, okay, he's going to stop any time, and if he stops, I'm drawing back and I'm pulling the trigger. And he just trots on by me, probably at 20. I'd say it's 15 or 20 yards on my right side. So if he came up on my left, I would have gave him the old and had him stop. But he came up on my right. I didn't want to give him the old stop, and because then I would have to get around still and draw back. But eventually I get around because he is laser focused on this doe. Eventually I get around and he stops probably 30 yards and he's quartering away hard. And so I'm like, this is perfect. I'm going to get it right up in his rib cage and jack up all his stuff. And so I want to range him just to make sure. And I get 31 on the rangefinder. Right as I put my rangefinder down, he takes off.
Oh, man.
And so I'm like, well, there goes that. And so I'm like, son of a gun. But then the doe beds down again right in the trees behind me. And so I know he's there somewhere, but they both stay really still. And eventually they walk off and I don't get a shot. Well, time comes where I have to get out of the stand. I get down and I walk up to the house and I jump both of them.
Oh, man.
And so I'm like, son of a gun. And so they take off and I never see him again. And so that's the end of that story. So this is strike 3 on my season. And we're not done yet. And so this is middle of December. So the holidays are getting here. You know, we have my wife's family's Christmas that we have to go to. We have my family's Christmas we have to go to. I have to go back to work now because I took the first half of December off pretty much. And so now I have to go back to work, and I just knew that my hunting season was pretty much over. And so I talked to my wife and I was like, hey, let me go out to the lease just to see if I can get a doe. And so out at the county that our lease is in, we have a special late season where you can shoot does and spikes only. So no bucks. So I know at this point I'm not going to get a buck. So I'm like, hey, let me go out to the lease for, it was going to be 3 or 4 days. It was going to be 3 or 4 days, and I just laughed because the season ended on January 16th, and I was going to go out there like the 12th, 13th, and 14th, and it was just going to be me. I was going to go out there by myself. And so it was like January 8th or 10th or something like that. My family tested positive for COVID.
Yeah, because we were out there, and you were going to come hunt with us when me and my dad were out there for our last hunt of the year.
Yes.
And then all that happened. So
yeah, so my whole family tested positive for COVID. I never showed any symptoms, thank goodness, but my 2 boys and my wife all tested positive. And so I'm like, well, there goes that. All hope is lost, right? And so after a couple days, my wife's like, hey, we're all doing good. Why don't you just go out for a day just so you can get some meat? And so I leave one night. We put the kids down for bed. This is like 8 or 8:30. So we put the kids down. I go out. I pack up all my stuff and I leave that night, and I get to the lease. By the time I get all my stuff packed and leave and get out there, it's midnight. And so I get out there at midnight, and it's cold. It's like supposed to be 21 degrees or something that next morning.
Yeah.
And so I'm sleeping in my truck.
Oh my gosh.
out at the lease. And so I get there and I park, and I'm like, well, this is going to be a long night. And so I get on my phone just to play around. I end up falling asleep, and I wake up an hour later, and I'm freezing because I turned my truck off. So I turn my truck on and just let that heater run, and I go back to sleep for a few hours. I wake up super early to get to the stand that I'm going to sit in. And I have my rifle this time, so I'm not messing around. This is purely a meat hunt. So I took my rifle out there to see if I could get a doe. I took 4 bullets with me, which is more than I was going to need. I was going to need 1 or 2, and that was going to be it. That morning, I get in the stand, and I'm sitting there waiting on sun to rise. And legal shooting light was 7:08. Sunrise was 7:38. The feeder is supposed to go off at 7. So the feeder goes off at 7. And it's a spin. It's one of the spin type feeders, so it slings corn everywhere. And 7:05, there's probably 6 or 7 deer on their way to that feeder that I can see. And I can barely see, but I know that I can see several deer sitting under this feeder. And there's mesquites in the way, kind of a little bit, and there's still deer hanging around back in the mesquites behind the feeder. And so there's 2 deer that are underneath the feeder that I have a shot at. One of them is a small buck, like probably a 6-pointer, and then the other one is a little fork. And so I'm like, well, neither of those are legal, so I can't shoot either of those. But there's one little doe, little yearling doe. I'm not going to shoot her. And then there's like 2 or 3 mature does that are hanging out in the mesquites back behind there. And so I'm able to get my gun up, and the little yearling doe spots me, and she doesn't blow or anything, but the other does can tell that she's kind of on alert.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, just be really still, and maybe those other does will make their way up. And so I see this other doe, this one, it looks like the most mature doe. She's back in the mesquites, and she kind of perks her head up and looks off to my right. And so I'm like, well, that's weird. I wonder what's coming up. There's got to be something over there. Because she's like pretty focused in on whatever this is. And so I see this bobcat coming through the mesquites on my right. I'm like, oh, okay. So eventually they all kind of meander off up the hill behind the feeder. So I'm like, well, this bobcat just ruined this hunt, so I'm going to take him out because he's coming directly in front of me, probably 15 yards from my stand.
Yeah.
And he spots me, so he's kind of scurrying kind of quick, and he'll stop every now and then and look at me. And I get my crosshairs, and he's close enough to where he fills up my entire scope. I get my crosshairs on him, dude, and I'm ready to blow him into oblivion. And I squeeze the trigger, and it clicks. And I'm like, are you kidding me? What is going on? And so I hurry real quick, and I chamber another round, and there's a round in the chamber. Like, I didn't forget to put a round in the chamber. It pops out and hits the ground. I put another one in, and by that time the bobcat's gone because he was already aware of my existence. So he took off once I moved. So I'm pretty upset. I'm like, first, this bobcat ruins my deer hunt, and then I can't even shoot the bobcat because my gun misfires. Great. This is just the cherry on top of my season. And so I wait there for probably 20 or 30 minutes, trying to figure out what the heck's going on. I'm like, okay, I'm going to give it one more shot. And so I wait there 20 or 30 minutes, and this spike is coming up to my left down in the draw because there's a draw behind me. If you go watch my episode of Texas Dirt, this is the stand I'm sitting in.
Yeah.
The stand that I was talking about, and that is on that video. There's a draw behind me. The feeder is in front of me. There's a spike coming up to my left, and I'm like, dude, no way, this is freaking perfect. Like, what are the odds that I'm going to see a spike in the spike only season?
Yeah, exactly.
And so I'm like, sweet. And so he's coming up through the trees, and I get my gun on him just to make sure, because I look at him through the scope, and he sees me get my gun up. And so he kind of spooks a little bit and is quartering away and turns around, and I get him in my crosshairs, and I'm ready to, I squeeze the trigger, and it clicks again. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. Like, what is going on right now? Like, I have shot this gun my entire life, pretty much. Like, I got this gun when I was preteen. Like, I've had this gun for a long time, and it has never misfired on me, ever.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I am fuming at this point because he runs off or whatever. And so I'm like, well, it's probably 8 or 8:30 at this point, still pretty early in the morning hunt. And I'm like, well, there's no point in me sitting up here. My gun won't work. And so I get down, and I know it's either the gun or the ammo. And I've shot this ammo before. This is probably the last 4 rounds in this box. So we've shot all the other ones in this box. And I'm like, well, surely it's not the ammo. But I look on the back of the 2 rounds that I fired, and you can see where the punch had punched the center fire on these rounds. And so I'm like, well, maybe it is the ammo, and so I go and I try and I pull off somewhere random, and I set out a water bottle. I threw out a water bottle in the grass just to give me something to aim at. And so I go and I shoot all 4 of these rounds, and all 4 of them misfire. All 4 of them. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And then I was like, maybe I can run into town, because our lease is not very far from town. Maybe I can run into town, find some 30-06 ammo, and just hunt the rest of the day. And so I go to one spot, and I'm looking at the ammo that they have, and the lady asked me what I'm looking for, and I said 30-06, and she said, nope, we don't have any. I was like, dadgummit. I was like, well, do you know anywhere else that would maybe have some? And she was like, yeah, try, this place down the road. So I'm like, okay, thanks. And so I go to that place. Luckily, they had some. Bought 2 boxes because I wasn't messing around. With not having any ammo. Bought 2 boxes of ammo. Go back out to the lease, and I'm like, well, I guess and I test fire one of these rounds, and it works like a charm. Shoots a hole straight through the cactus I was aiming at, And so I'm like, okay, great. I'm back in business now. And so I basically just drive around the rest of the day. I'll park every now and then and just kind of walk and see if I can see anything. Everything that I see the rest of the day is either running or spots me first. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'll sit somewhere the evening hunt. So I sit in the same stand thinking that these deer are on a clock. Once that feeder goes off, they'll be there. I sit in the same stand, feeder goes off, and I don't see nothing until sundown. And right at the legal shooting light ends, I see a doe at the top of this hill, or like on this ridge line where I can't shoot her because I don't know what's on the other side. And so I'm like, and I don't really, if I do hit this doe, I don't want to be tracking her in the dark, and I'm already exhausted from today because I hiked 3 miles, whatever. I don't really want to be tracking this doe in the nighttime. And so I end up letting her go, don't get anything, go home empty-handed.
Mm-hmm.
And the season ends 2 days later. And I'm like, son of a gun. So that was pretty much a sum up of how my season went. Super depressing, although it was a very it wasn't depressing. It was an emotional roller coaster for sure. I learned a lot. It was bittersweet, to say the least, because I did get a lot of opportunity, and I spent a lot of time in the woods, which is always, a gift from our Lord. But even though I wasn't successful, I did learn some very valuable lessons. To one, if the deer you're shooting at has you pegged, aim low.
Or don't.
Yeah, or don't. Kind of bit me in the butt later. But more often than not, aim low, but not too low, I guess.
Don't aim low all the time, just sometimes. See what happens. Yeah.
Just in the right time.
That'll work. That'll work out good.
Yeah. Lesson number 2 was always check your ammo before you go out. And lesson number 3, shoot a doe early season, just because if you get the opportunity, just to have some meat in the fruit.
Man, I was gonna say something similar, because if you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you've heard my updates throughout the year, and then my dad and I's recap a few episodes ago. If you haven't heard that, if you want the full lowdown on our season, go listen to, I think it's the season finale or something is what we titled that podcast episode. But all as to say, we both had very similar frustrations this year with a lot of stuff. And obviously you had 2 properties to hunt. I just had the Texas dirt property.
Right.
But I agree. You killing deer earlier definitely is beneficial. And it's, there's always that saying of don't pass on the first day what you're willing to shoot on the last.
100%.
And there's a fine line between that and the management tactics that we're trying to implement, because I had more shots at deer that in previous years I totally would have shot, like as far as bucks, than I've ever had before.
Yeah.
And I passed on every single one of them. I never drew back on a buck, and I only had an encounter with a buck that I would have shot 100% no matter what one time, and I didn't get a shot at him.
Right.
So it was frustrating for that, and definitely like that last trip out there before late season when general was still open and you could still shoot bucks. I was definitely thinking, oh man, if that 3 or 4, whatever he was, that young 8-point comes in, it's gonna be hard to pass on him, being the last time of the year. And I was probably really fortunate that he didn't come in. Like, I was frustrated. I was like, man, I'm burning a buck tag this year, but at the same time I was like, whew, he's going to be around next year, and he's going to be a stud. So there's pros and cons to passing on bucks, and certainly you want to let the young ones walk. But when you're a meat hunter, which is at the ground roots what we are, that you got to fill the freezer. So
for sure, yeah. I definitely gambled this year because my Collin County property is not one that I'm going to shoot a bunch of does off of, because it's not very big to begin with, and the does being there are one of the things that keeps the bucks there. And so I'm not going to shoot a bunch of does off of that, because we don't have a whole lot of deer running around. We just have really high quality, I would say.
Yeah.
And so me being greedy gambled and kind of focused on that Collin County property to see if I could get one of those high quality bucks, and didn't really take any time to go out to the lease and do a true meat hunt anyways. So it was a gamble on my part, and now I'm eating tag soup for it. So
it happens.
Yeah, and it happens to everybody, but it'll come around next year and we'll see what happens then.
Yeah, it will, for sure. Well, buddy, I appreciate you jumping on here and sharing your frustrations. And I obviously it's not necessarily a success story in having a deer or a big deer or anything like that on the ground, but we share this content, whether it's this or our Texas Dirt series or whatever it might be. We share it with our listeners and our followers because I like to think of us at Fall Obsession as not like everybody else out there. We're unique, and that is because we are blue collar outdoorsmen, everyday hunters, same as everybody else in America. We just have this avenue that we get to share high quality content, showcasing that, and that's our goal. So stories like this, episode 4, your episode of Texas Dirt series, that's exactly what that shows, is that we're all human. We all make the same mistakes. And,
Absolutely.
Maybe
Yes.
I'm sure there's somebody else listening to this podcast who had a missed shot or a bad shot or something this past year. Happens to all of us, man. Every single one of us has done that, been there, and it'll probably happen again one year for all we know.
Yeah, and I was very eager to get on here and share how my season went, because I personally learned a lot of lessons, and so if I can share that and teach somebody else, and so they can avoid the mistakes that I made, then it was all worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, guys, thank you all for listening to another Fall Obsession podcast episode. If you guys have not already, hit that follow and subscribe button on whatever podcast app. Well, hit that follow and subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you guys are listening on. We are on all major podcast platforms, as well as our YouTube channel and fallobsession.com. Our YouTube channel is something that we are putting out new videos pretty regularly. I already talked at the beginning about our intent to put out more podcast videos. There will not be one going with this episode, but future episodes we hope to have a video accompanying all of them. And then we got plenty of other content coming y'all's way, including a new series that we're starting, My Obsession series. We already got our first installment out with that. Already talking to a couple guys about our next guest that we're going to have on that show, and super excited to get those productions going. Fallobsession.com is our website. That's our hub. That's where you guys can go to find all of our content. We got video series, product reviews, wild game recipes, educational articles. You name it, we got it. We cover hundreds of different topics on that website in a variety of different forms of content. So go over there and check us out. We also got some apparel on there, our online store. We need to get some new designs worked up for you guys to get them out there, but we do have a bunch of stuff still on there right now from this past fall. So head on over, check out what we got, support your local hunting business, and pick up some Fall Obsession swag. And also on the page, fallobsession.com/podcast, that's the page you guys can go to listen to all of our podcasts from our website. But another thing that we're working toward is episode 100. And we're in the 90s now with our episode count, so we're only a few weeks out from having episode 100. That episode is going to have Nick, myself, and our other two administrators on here. It'll be the first time all four of us record a podcast together. And we're going to talk kind of about not just Fall Obsession and everything that we got going on, but also showcase some highlights of our podcast. And we also want to give you guys the chance to be involved in that episode by asking questions, suggesting topics, just wanting general information on stuff, whatever it might be. So if you guys feel inclined, head on over to that webpage. Again, it's fallobsession.com/podcast, and send us some feedback for episode 100. Whatever you guys send us, we'll be sure that we bring it up, discuss it in that episode. Again, coming up here in just a few short weeks. Finally, sponsor shout out, Ridge Rock Hunt Company, Derek and Lacey, the folks over there. They book hunts. They will hook you up with your next hunting adventure and figure out where you need to go, what you need to do, what you're trying to hunt, and what you're looking to spend on it. Very fine folks. We've really enjoyed getting to know them over the past couple years and cultivating that relationship, and now happy since they started this brand that we're able to partner with them and hopefully send some business their way. So be sure that you head on over, check them out on social media and their website. Again, that's Ridge Rock Hunt Company, and see if they might have something to help you get set up with that hunt you've been waiting to book for 2022. So it's about that time of year to start making plans. So go check them out. Nick, did I miss anything, buddy?
Nah, you hit it all, man.
All right, then. Well, guys, thank y'all for listening again, and we will catch you guys again next week for another Fall Obsession podcast episode. See you then.
See you later.